Well, we're in our third week of Esther. Who's been here for the other 2 weeks? A few people have. I'll give you a bit of a sum up if you've missed any of the weeks. But Mark's given us this great introduction of the first 4 chapters of the book. And we've been introduced to 4 main characters in the story. I wonder if any of you can remember any of the characters that are in the story. Mordecai. Oh. I'll give you a clue. The book's named after her. Esther. Woohoo! So we got Mordecai, Esther. What was that one? Haman, yes. Or what do we say when we hear Haman? Boo! That's right. He's the baddie. And then there's one more. Who's right at the very beginning of the story? Before we even meet Esther. The king, yes, but we did have Vashti too, so she's kind of like, she's number 5, but because she's only in chapter 1, she kind of drops off of the main ones. But yes, we have the king of Persia, or King Xerxes, and then we have Vashti, who is the first queen. So King Xerxes, he's the king of Persia, and he lives in this place called Susa. And Esther, we also learn that she has another name. Can anyone remember Esther's other name? Hadassah, that's right. And she's related to Mordecai. Can anyone remember how she's related to Mordecai? Yeah, it's cousin, but in their terms they would have classified it niece as well because he was much older. So it was the uncle's daughter to Mordecai, so that would make it cousins. But because of the age difference, they also used it. So both of them are correct, so well done. And we've got Haman, who's boo. He's the royal official to the king, and he's the bad guy of the story. So the book of Esther starts off with this King Xerxes, and he's throwing this lavish banquet with all his nobles and officials, and he's consuming lots of food and lots of wine. And his wife, Queen Vashti, she's also having a banquet with all the ladies. So the king's with all the men and all his officials, while the queen is having a lovely party with her girlfriends. Sounds like a pajama party. Yeah. And so at this time, the king, he wants to show off his wife. And so he summons her to come from her party to his party. And he's had a few to drink. He's probably quite intoxicated at this point, and he wants her to come and parade her beauty for everybody at his banquet. And but when she's called, she doesn't want to do that. And Mark talked about how we don't hear it in the text, but the interpretation is that she would have to parade without her clothes on was probably what was going to be asked of her, and how Vashti refused. She obviously was a modest woman and didn't want to do that, and it was probably a good thing that she stood up to the king, but it was also very dangerous to go against what the king has said. And the result of her refusing to go before this drunk king and all his guests, it causes the king to banish her from her position. And he also institutes this new law that, because the officials were saying, well, if Vashti does this to the king, all our wives are going to think, they can stand up to us. I think this is where women's rights started back in this day. And so they put in this law and said that all males throughout the provinces would be allowed to be the ruler of their households. I wonder how long that lasted for, but because they didn't want what Vashti did to the king to happen in their households as well. So they instituted this. So a little bit later on, the king wants a new queen. And then he thinks, how am I going to do this? So the officials say, well, let's bring in a whole heap of young, beautiful virgins for you and bring them into the harem, and we'll have a bit of a beauty contest, and you can choose your favourite to be your new queen. So this happens. All these women get brought in, but among these women is Esther, who's also known as Hadassah. And she'd been raised by her cousin Mordecai, because her parents had died. So Mordecai took her in effectively as her daughter. He was the guardian to her. And Mordecai advises Esther, because, she's taken into this harem. He says to her, just keep quiet that you are a Jew. Just keep quiet about your heritage. Because he wanted her to be safe. He didn't want her to be uncovered. And verse 9 of chapter 2, and I think it's going to come up on the screen, has this about what the king thought about Esther when he first met her. The king pleased. She pleased him and won his favour. Now this word favour is going to be something we're going to look at throughout this book. Favour. What do you think favour means? What do you think it means? What was that? Yes. So like doing a favour, yes. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. What about in this case? In a favourable position, so being in a good position? Yes, yep. What about in this sense? She won his favour. What do you think it means? Yeah. That she was the best? He liked her the best? Yep. And where the word favour, if we extend it out, it becomes favourite. So that's kind of where you're going with that idea that, he liked her the best. It's also a term where we think of importance. A term that we think when somebody's putting favour on us, it's like a blessing or a goodness or a special focus on that. So this word favour comes out and it has lots of different meanings, all the things that you've said today. So then Esther is brought into the harem. She's pleased the king at first sight, and now she's going to be prepared with 12 months of intense beauty treatments. Oh, I think, wow. I don't know that I could fill my day with that much beauty treatments. I'm a wash my hair and put it up girl. Like I might put deodorant on, but I'm not a lavish person. But I've known people that, put on lots of makeup and probably, a good hour maybe would take some people to put on, their beauty treatment. I'm a, 2 minutes sort of person. But these guys did it for 12 months. And that's all they kind of did was these beauty treatments, oils and special perfume things. Whew, I think they'd be flammable, they'd have so much stuff on them. And they were also fed special food because they wanted them to be remain beautiful, so they probably had lots of really nourishing food. I don't think they would have had McDonald's and KFC. I think they got lots of nutritious food and things to keep them looking lovely. And back then, they liked people with a bit of hips. I don't think, today's women were, beauty is seen as being super thin. Back then, they actually liked women with a bit of curves. So, and they were all being prepared for their one night with the king, to have this competition of, I've got to get a really good experience with the king so that he's going to think I'm the best so that they can become queen. And when Esther finally got her time with the king, because after 12 months, we read in verse 17, it says, "Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favour and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." We see this word favour again. And we see it in amongst that, he was attracted to her more. She had approval more than any others, but she had favour, which is more than just approval, more than just being attracted. This is something special upon her life. She was going to be the favourite and have blessings. At the end of chapter 2, we hear of how Mordecai, who's the cousin to Esther, he was at the palace gates and he worked for the king. But he overheard 2 of the king's officials planning to kill the king. And he was like, oh dear, this is not good. So being a good man, Mordecai was a good man, he went and told his cousin, the queen, and said, look, this is what's happening. These two men are planning to kill the king. And so the queen relays that message to the king. And the king, is obviously, wow, oh my goodness, people are trying to kill me. And so he confronts these two officials, these two men that worked for him, and they were found guilty. And so they were impaled on poles. Now, some very gruesome stuff in this book. I didn't tell the kids about this part of the story. We talked about baddies and goodies and kept it kind of PG rating. But this story of uncovering this plot will come important a little bit later. So keep in mind this story of how the king became aware because of Mordecai overhearing this conversation. So keep that in mind for a little bit later. In chapter 3, Mark introduced us to the character of Haman, whom the king put above all his other nobles. He elevated his position. The king had commanded that all the other officials should bow before Haman in honour of him. So he considered this man, worthy of having people bow to him. But Mordecai, who's Esther's cousin, he refused to bow before Haman. Now, it doesn't tell us why, but my thinking is he knows that he's a bad egg. Because it doesn't say he didn't bow before the king. He just didn't bow before Haman. And I think he sensed something in him that was not quite right. But Haman was furious with his refusal. And especially because Mordecai was a Jew. He didn't like the Jewish people. Because his history of his people, because he was an Agagite, if I can get that right, Agagite, they had been wiped out in the time of Samuel. And so he had a grudge because, his family had come up against the Jewish people and been wiped out, and he was a descendant. And so there was some bitterness already in his life. So he was furious with his refusal, particularly because he was a Jew. But he wasn't just mad at Mordecai, he was mad at all the Jews. So Haman plotted to wipe out all the Jews in Susa. And he presented this idea to the king, saying that they were a disobedient people. They do different things. They have different ways. We need to get rid of them because they're going to be a problem for you. He presented them as a problem to the king. So a decree was established, so like a law, was established that on a certain date, which happened to be actually 11 months from now, because they'd kind of thrown their lots, and that was the dates that it came up on, that the Jewish people of Susa would be destroyed. So this law was distributed out to all the people so that they knew what the law was. They knew that it was coming and that they would be wiping out the Jewish people in the region of Susa. So Mordecai and all the Jews were obviously very disturbed by this news. And they dressed in sackcloth, which was common for people grieving. And they had ashes on them. And they started to mourn. Esther found out that Mordecai was dressed like this. She didn't know why. She just thought, why is my cousin, my guardian, the person who raised me, why is he upset? And so she sent clothes out to him, and he refused. But a message came back to her about this law that had been sent out. And so she found out from one of the attendants that went out that this law had been issued about the destruction of her people. She was Jewish. And Mordecai sent word asking Esther to go before the king to beg for mercy. Mercy for all the Jewish people. But Esther was fearful. She was fearful of going before the king, because if you weren't summoned and you went before the king, that could bring about your death. You weren't allowed to just rock up and say, "Hey, king, how you going today?" You had to be invited. into his presence. And she would have known the story of how Queen Vashti got banished. So she would have known that this king is serious. Like, he doesn't play around. He doesn't, suffer fools, as the expression goes. And she also knew that she hadn't been called by the king for 30 days. So that favour that she had, she probably thought she'd lost that favour. The king had lost interest in her. And so she was very afraid of even, speaking to the king. But Mordecai sent these words back to her, and it's a famous part of the book of Esther. And it's chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. He sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. A well-quoted verse, for such a time as this. So Esther changes her mind. I think she must have got a bolt of courage somewhere in that. Or maybe a conviction that, that God's going to provide a solution, but I'm going to miss out if I don't take my part. That my family will perish if I don't do this. My nation, my whole community will perish. The idea that she's in this position for such a time as this. So she changes her mind and decides to attempt to go before the king. But after, she's going to pray, she's going to fast for 3 days. And then she says, when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Wow. What a turn. What a sacrifice. This brings us to the start of chapter 5, which we're going to look at today. So that's the recap. Is everyone back on board? Everyone's got the idea, the picture of where we're at. Her life is like, going to be hanging in the balance, but she's going to attempt to go before the king. Chapter 5 says, on the 3rd day, so she's done her fasting, and all her people have done the fasting with her. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her. And he held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. He was pleased with her. It implies that favour has come back. Her life has been spared. That's the miracle in itself. He allowed her to come. But even before she asked to come, he extends his scepter to her. And that's a sign of grace and favour and acceptance that she would be not killed for a start, but that she was allowed to even come to see the king. This is quite a change from what we see in the story with Vashti. Vashti, who was summoned by the king, but did not come. Where Queen Esther, who hadn't been summoned, but she was allowed to come. I think there's somebody orchestrating in this story. It doesn't say the name of God in any of the book of Esther, but we can see these things being orchestrated, that She should have been put to death for going before the king. But she pleased him. She had favour. He extended grace to her. Verse 3 said, Then the king asked, What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you. Now this expression, even up to half the kingdom, is not literal. The king wouldn't have literally given her half of his kingdom, but it was an expression of you can ask for what you like within reason. You know, like he was extending a generous offer to her. But he was willing to grant any reasonable request from her. Now this is like on top of favour. This is like the favour of favour. Like, because she could have died for coming before the king. He not only accepts her, but he's willing to offer her up to half of his kingdom. That's just impressive. Verse 4 says, If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king together with Haman, boo, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom. So he's this generous offer again. It will be granted. Esther replied, My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favour, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfil my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Esther is so clever. She's got wisdom that, 1,000 men would have. She's clever in planning a second meeting, a second banquet. It not only builds suspense in the story, but it is wise in building trust with the king. Because then when she finally does have her request, it will be received even more favourably. Because she's got favour so far, just in the story. That she's allowed to come to him, that she's allowed to have a request, that he's offering her anything. But she's wanting to prolong that favour so that when he comes to her a second time, that she's even got more of his favour. And by inviting Haman, because she knows that he's the baddie, she wants to be able to face him face to face when she reveals the stuff before the king. And she wants him before the king to realise what he has done. Verse 9 says, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honoured him, and now he had elevated him above the nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person that Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, Have a pole set up. They're really into these poles, I think. Have a pole set up reaching to a height of 50 cubits and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So Haman, feeling so high and mighty after being elevated by the king and being the only official invited to Queen Esther's banquet, he's still enraged by Mordecai, still got this hatred towards him. And then he goes to his wife and his friends and complains to them, but they encourage him to ask the king to impale Mordecai on a pole. This is why we need to be careful who we hang out with, who we get advice from. Mordecai was enraged already, and his wife and his friends just fueled it. Yeah, we agree. Go get a pole and get the king to put him on, impale on him. Well, sometimes when we're having a really moment, do we go to somebody who's going to make us even more? We need to find someone who will kind of level us. And in a marriage particularly, that's kind of the ideal balance, isn't it? Yes, you want validation when you're feeling mad about something, but you need someone to kind of, calm you down. Calm the jets. You need a good friend who can do that for you. But Mordecai, they were just throwing fuel on the fire and gave him even more great advice about these poles. Don't know what the fascination with the poles were. We need to be careful of the company we keep, as they can keep our anger fueled or they can keep us in check. Verse 6 says, chapter 6, that night the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, which is like the historical book, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. You know, you pick up a really boring book to try and make you go to sleep. I think that's what he was kind of doing. You know, let's just read the historical stuff. Book of Numbers, son of. No, the Bible is brilliant. All of it is divine. But yeah, there are some bits that are a bit more tedious than others. But he had this record read to him. And it was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, who are two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Remember that story I told you, keep hold of because it's going to be important? The king's now reading about it and being reminded of Mordecai's, righteous act, really. His good nature to tell the king that there's some people plotting against him. And so it got him thinking, what am I going to do? I've been reminded of this. Verse 3 says, what honour and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. And his attendant said, nothing has been done for him. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king. And he was wanting to talk to him about impaling Mordecai on the pole that he had set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him what should be done for the man the king delights to honour. Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honour than me, Mr. High and Mighty? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honour, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honour. Wow. The Bible's funny, hey? God has a really good sense of humour. Haman is thinking, it's about him. The king's going to do this whole lavish act for me. He's going to bring me pride and honour. He has no idea that the king is wanting to honour his enemy, his arch nemesis, Mordecai. Verse 10, go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested. for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on the horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honour." That's like sticking in the knife and twisting it, isn't it? Like, woo! I can imagine his shock, his almost humiliation that, oh my gosh, I have to ride. I'm going to be that person that has to take him through the city proclaiming, "This is what happens to who the king honours." Like, whew, a real turn of events. This marker of, in the story of when the king reads about the history of what Mordecai has done, kind of flips the story. There's still this law that's going to wipe out the Jewish people on this particular date, but we're seeing a turn of events that kind of like, I think there's something coming. It's not going to be all doom and gloom. I can see that there's some hope. I see that there's going to be something coming, that the king's going to see it for what it is. Mordecai had refused to honour Haman by bowing down to him. But instead, Haman is forced to honour Mordecai in such a public and lavish manner. Real turn of events. Don't mess with God's people. Verse 12 says, "Afterward Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief." I can just imagine him, tail between his legs. "And he told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisers and his wife Zeresh said to him, 'Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin.'" What great encouragers they are. Like, one minute they're fueling his anger, now they're just like, "Oh, look, it's all doom and gloom here, Haman. It's all downhill from here." He's humiliated, feeling defeated. And his wife and friends don't bring him any comfort at all. In fact, they make it 10 times worse for him. They simply highlight his downfall and predict that he would come to ruin. We don't need people like that around us. We need people who will see hope, people who will encourage us even when we're feeling defeated. We don't need people to wind us up when we're angry, but we do need people to encourage us when we're feeling defeated. But even though this book does not mention God, we can certainly see the work of God throughout this story. We see the incredible favour that Esther experiences from the very first time that the king sees her, to the extension of his sceptre, to the offering of up to half of his kingdom. Even the very fact that Esther becomes queen at the very time that her people are being threatened is surely evidence that God is at work in the background. The incredible timing of the king not sleeping and reading those stories of his history and finding the story about Mordecai revealing those two people wanting to plot his death at the exact time just before Haman is going to come and want to plot the death of Mordecai to the king. The righteous actions of both Mordecai and Esther all speak of God's intervention and guidance. Haman's wife and friends even see how Haman does not have a chance against Mordecai because of his Jewish faith. I think the last passage we read, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin," it said. They even notice that don't mess with God's people. You can't fight a powerful God. God is no doubt protecting his people. Esther and Mordecai's call to fast implies their Jewish faith, as this was a common practice, not just when they were grieving, but because of the link to prayers of petition to God in times of need. Fasting wasn't just about making a social justice statement or I don't feel like eating because I'm really sad. It was a state of prayer. Our body is praying because we need God to act. That was where the history of fasting came from the Jewish faith. Verse 14 says, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Now you have to come back next week to know what happens at the second banquet. But we get a glimpse of kind of where the story is headed. It all seemed doom and gloom, that the Jewish people will be all wiped out. And then we thought, oh gosh, that Haman's going to come and impale Mordecai on a pole. But there's a flip of events. A flip of events. And Mark talked about the pieces of the story and how sometimes, the pieces that we are putting together, we think it's one picture. But God's actually working on a completely different picture. And we see, what could possibly be one picture, the wipeout of a Jewish nation, the wipeout of God's people. But we see a flip of events, that there's a glimpse of a different story, a much bigger story of what God is putting pieces together in. In chapters 5 and 6, we see how Esther seems to claim power in the story. Despite her being a woman, a Jew, and an orphan, but she uses this power wisely for good to try and save her people. This is in contrast to the way that the king and Haman had used their power. They'd done it as displays of wealth and status. They'd done it for their own benefit, out of their own greed, out of their own hatred. Haman's pride and anger fueled his expression of power, where Esther used power out of humility and compassion for her people. In our world today, we see many people in high positions who express their power in those same ways, out of selfish ambition, anger, or pride. But God calls us to be like Esther and use our positions for the benefit of others, not just for ourselves. God wants us to be wise in our actions like Esther, not reactionary from our wounded pride like Haman. Mordecai and Esther did not seek to gain honour, but they were given honour nonetheless. Although Esther initially is concerned for her own safety in approaching the king, she eventually chooses to go before the king in the ultimate act of sacrifice for her people. It models for us how Jesus teaches in his time on earth that it is not about being on top or the best, but he rather showed us what it is to be an example of humbly serving. Jesus also willingly chose death as the ultimate sacrifice for his people, for all of us today. The New Interpreter's Bible Commentary says, the book of Esther reminds us that even when God appears to be absent, because he's not mentioned by name, God can be most present, working through willing followers. We're going to sing a song, our final song, in a moment. And as the music team come back up, I want to ask you, are you a willing follower of God? Are you willing to put aside your own interests in order to benefit others? Are you acting in a wise way, or do you react out of hurt feelings? Are you using your position in life for a display of your wealth, the pride or success, or wisely in order to bring good to those you serve? Can you see the hand of God working in your life even when you feel he's been silent? Have you experienced God's favour? Are you in this place for such a time as this? Has God been orchestrating all the behind the scenes stuff to get to you where you are today? We're going to sing this song, Waymaker. And it says, you are here moving in our midst. I worship you, I worship you. And it says, you are working in this place. You are touching every heart. You are healing every heart. You are turning lives around. You are mending every heart. And the bridge says, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. May today be a time where you see where God has been working. Even when you haven't felt his presence. Even when you felt he's been silent. Where has God been putting you together? Putting the pieces together in your story to bring you favour. To bring you to where you are today. Let's sing together.